Okay, thanks a lot, Kathy. It's really good to be here. We're a small but mighty group, and we're also on Facebook Live. We're going to talk about the writer's craft a little bit today, what it takes to do some of the research, particularly as regarding weaving facts into fiction, and what that's all about, and why facts are so important, because in almost any genre of writing that you can think of, facts do matter. Even in like way out there science fiction, if I don't know that, Venus is between Mercury and Earth, there's going to be a lot of problems. It's going to make you stop. If you think about Game of Thrones, and they can get away with a lot more in movies than they can in books, I think, in movies and TV, in terms of, stretching our credibility. There's a lot of criticism of the last 2 seasons of Game of Thrones, one of which being the distance that Jon Snow was able to travel in that wilderness was crazy. And I just got a video chat in my ear. Sorry about that. And it was crazy, and there was no way he could have covered that much ground in that little bit amount of time.
Yeah, that's all we have right now.
So,
okay.
Sorry, we're having some technical issues here. I'm still hearing a lot of chatter in the background.
That's all we have right now.
Hello, everybody. I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight. Hello, everybody.
That's all we have right now.
Hello, everybody. I'd like to thank you for joining us
Hey,
tonight.
Kathy, I apologize for the technical issues. I wonder if we should.
That's all we have right now.
And here's Dennis. Everybody, I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight. Hello, everybody.
Are we hearing a lot of chatter in the background? Are we ready to go?
Yes.
We're still having issues.
I hear it coming through your microphone.
Does that help? Did something just happen, or did that help? I just shut my tablet down. I'll
I can start because I'm hearing a lot of background chatter.
How's that?
That's good.
I think it stopped. Okay, sorry everybody. So anyway, let's try again. I think my phone might have been the problem. Live and learn. So we're going to talk about the craft of writing and what's involved in separating fact from fiction and why it matters. A little bit about myself. I'm originally from Chicago. My first 2 novels, Season of Lies and Killing the Curse, are about sports and politics, which were 2 of my passions. And the first book imagined a crazy fan who would do anything to make sure the Cubs won the World Series. It was before the real life Cubs actually won the World Series. And then the president gets involved. He's a diehard Cubs fan, and a lot more is at stake than winning Game 7. The second book, Season of Lies, picks up the following season, involving Trey Van Omen, a star pitcher for the Red Sox, who gets traded to the Cubs. He endorses my president, Luke Murphy, who's running for re-election, and as would happen in real life, the politics of destruction takes over, and people try to destroy his career as the baseball season. It's a crazy throughway race. We'll talk more about that in a minute. All come to a head, and fortunately for me as an author, baseball and politics both come to a head in September, October, November, and that's where the book climaxes. In this review from the Books and Crooks website, about Season of Lies, which kind of mirrors in some ways what's going on right now in politics. There's nothing unusual about Hollywood celebrities speaking out on behalf of their favorite presidential candidates, not so much Major League Baseball players until now, and author Dennis Hetzel's new thriller, Season of Lies. Enter Trey Van Omen, a star pitcher hired by the Cubs to help the team build a new baseball dynasty. Just as the season gets underway, so does a heated three-way presidential race. President Luke Murphy, the incumbent Republican, has been keeping a secret since his college days. We'll be talking about that in a second, until one of his opponents decides to leak the dirty details to a talk radio show. With his campaign and his marriage in jeopardy, Murphy, a loyal Cub fan, enlists Van Omen's endorsement, much to the chagrin of his teammates and the owner, who supports one of the other candidates. It's a complex story about a dirty presidential campaign and a baseball team striving for another championship, told from different characters' perspectives, with such issues as sexual politics, religion, terrorism, fake news, and scandals. So with all that said, I'm going to move into the slide deck now, and hopefully you'll find it pretty interesting. We'll be talking about not only baseball stuff, politics, third-party candidates, crazy astronomical events, UFOs, and a whole bunch of other things in the next few minutes. So let me get this up and running. So here we go. We are off. And if there's any questions along the way, I'll get to them at the end, if not sooner. So we're going to cover a number of things, but one of the things I want to start with is my friend Rick Robinson, because Killing the Curse couldn't have happened without Rick. Rick and I were on the board of the Northern Kentucky Chamber of Commerce on a trip to Frankfort, Kentucky one day. Rick had already published a couple of his excellent political thrillers. He's got a new one out right now, by the way. And, you know, I said, well, you know, as a journalist, an editor, a reporter, I'd always been accused of writing fiction, but, you know, I never did it on purpose. And I wanted to try it, and we started kicking things around. And I should add that getting Rick to wear a Cubs hat in this picture was pretty amazing, because he's a huge Cincinnati Reds fan, and he probably really hates the Cubs in his heart, except he just sort of appeased me for the photo. But I said, what if the Cubs were in the World Series and a crazy fan would do anything to make sure they won? And this was before the real world Cubs had actually overcome their curse in 2016. And Rick said, that's a book. And the rest, as they say, is history. So that's why I'm here. So here's some of the stuff we're going to cover. I already kind of alluded to it. And I want to give you a little bit of a sneak preview of my third novel, The Vanished, which is quite a bit different than the first two. It's a little more of a mysterious story, and it's set in the beach community of North Carolina, where I live now. So we'll talk more about that towards the end. The first thing I want to say about facts and why they matter, and part of it's my training as a journalist, because, you know, all the noise in Washington aside, the reality is that bad facts are like speed bumps. They slow down the reader. And I remember Rick actually telling me once about how he counted the number of steps in a building so you could accurately have that little detail in one of his stories. And when you think about it, when you see something that you know is wrong, even if 95% of the readers of the book would not know it's wrong, it distracts you. It's a bump. It's a bump in the road. It breaks the mood at best. It adds authenticity to get things right. It's a simple example. If I'm writing, you know, about you know, Columbus, Ohio, where I lived until I moved here, and I said, you know, Broad Avenue instead of Broad Street, anybody who knows Columbus would go, well, that's wrong. And, you know, books, and makes you wonder if the author really is being careful. Here's a real good example from from Killing the Curse. In chapter 1 of Killing the Curse, I kill the star pitcher's father, and I felt bad about it because I liked the guy. Don Van Omen is Trey Van Omen's father. Trey, in Killing the Curse, is actually a star pitcher for the Red Sox, and the premise being that if Don dies before Game 7 of the World Series, Trey either won't be able to pitch or certainly won't be very focused if he is pitching, thus increasing the Cubs' chances to win dramatically. I put Don in Lewiston, Idaho, where he, you know, is a classic car parts person, a former auto racer. He's a widower, kind of an interesting guy, actually. And he's driving parts from Lewiston, Idaho to Missoula, Montana. I didn't have time to go back to the Pacific Northwest, but I used Google Earth to find a spot along US Highway 12 where it would be reasonable and logical for Don to go off the road into the river that runs along US 12. and east of a little town called Kamaya, where I had Don stop for lunch. And I also discovered, yes, it is possible to hack into the OnStars system of a Chevy pickup truck, at least theoretically possible, and take control of the vehicle, which is, again, how Don meets his demise. And then since I wrote the book, there have been more experiments conducted. The government was able to show how you could get control of a Jeep, as I recall, a Jeep Cherokee or something like that, and get hold of the systems there. So these are the things you do to bring authenticity and credibility, to your story. Because again, for the readers that know whatever it is you're writing about, you want it to feel right. You want it to feel true. This is Interstate 80, speaking of highways, in central Illinois, near where I grew up in Chicago. And again, I wanted to set the scene, carefully and accurately. There's a scene in the book that's actually very important because one of the key characters in Killing the Curse is a childhood friend of the president's named Bob Walters. He's a sports radio talk show host. I imagine him sort of as, Rush Limbaugh as a sports radio talk show host, if you can imagine how despicable that would be. Sorry for the political comment. And he's the man Cub fans love to hate. And so Bob is divorced, and the relationship between Bob and his ex-wife Mickey, and how he's going to, try to get things back together with her before the end of the book, is pretty important. And she has to rush back to Chicago when the life of their daughter is threatened as part of this larger plot. Over on the right, of course, is a photo of downtown Chicago. And again, here, there's a lot of scenes in Chicago because the story does involve the Cubs. And we're in Water Tower Place, we're in the Westin Hotel, and if I don't put Water Place on Michigan Avenue, where everyone in Chicago knows it is, it's going to feel wrong. So these are all things that, you learn to be careful about, where I do think my training as a journalist helped me quite a bit. This, of course, is one of the most important places of all, and that's Wrigley Field in Chicago. I took that photo myself in 2008 when they clinched the playoff appearance, but unfortunately they didn't get to the World Series that year. And again, I try to describe the area around Wrigley Field in both books, as accurately and realistically and interestingly as I can. One of the things I didn't expect when I started on these books was that it would really become sort of a personal journey for me. Until I actually started plotting the books out, I didn't realized that I had to write a backstory for my two main characters, Bob Walters and President Murphy. They're childhood friends who grew up together in the Chicago suburbs. Well, guess what? And I should add my bad guy, or at least my front and center bad guy, a guy named Tommy Shursky, which is a good Chicago ethnic name. Also is an only child who grew up in the suburbs, and guess what? I was an only child who grew up in the suburbs. One of the things I did as an only child growing up in the suburbs, I used to play a game called Stratomatic Baseball, which is on the right there, which kind of imagined fantasy baseball before there was fantasy baseball, and it was a card game where players performed pretty accurately to the way they performed in real life, and just like Tommy. There's a scene in the book where the Cubs were so bad back then that if you had them playing the better teams, it was very hard for them to win. So you would cheat a little bit, like say, well, Koufax can't pitch, the starter is injured for the Dodgers or whatever. You'd kind of do what you could to sort of help the Cubs along. And on the left is Ernie Banks. Everyone in Chicago knows Ernie, and he certainly was one of my childhood heroes. And as a quick aside, one of the things I learned, I heard the author Steve Berry, who writes a lot of great historical thrillers, science fiction-y historical thrillers, talk about the cliche that authors write about what they know, and he said, well, it is a cliche, and if you happen to know a lot going in about what you're writing about, that's great. But you need to write what you're passionate about, and that really resonated with me. I've always been passionate about baseball and politics, maybe if you're growing up in Chicago. Fortunately, I thought I knew a little bit about it, but, honestly, until I started researching these books, I realized how little I really knew in detail, or, how often our memories trick us, is that, we think things happened at a certain time in a certain way because it's sort of in our brains that way. But once we actually do the research and the work to find out what really happened, it's different. So going along that personal journey theme, this is little Dennis on the far right with a couple of my buddies in the suburb of Hoffman Estates, the northwest suburbs of Chicago. And we're really at the same age as a really important moment in killing the curse. And this, of course, was JFK's assassination. This is the iconic photo of Jackie Kennedy and then little Caroline and John Jr. During JFK's funeral procession in Washington, D.C. after he was shot. You have to remember, Chicago was in Central Time, and back then, I was so old, we walked home to lunch and came back, which is actually what we did. And you didn't go home at lunch and just watch TV. There wasn't media everywhere. You went home and had lunch, talked to your mom, and went back to school. So we didn't know JFK had been shot until after we got back after lunch. And I had my first male teacher, Mr. Fry, and a real together guy. He was a bit of a male role model for me too, in some respects. And he came in disheveled, which is unusual. His tie was loose, and he was crying. There were tears, and that's how we found JFK was killed. And I did an event in the Chicago area after Killing the Curse was published, where a longtime friend came who I hadn't seen in years, who was in that class, and he said there's a scene in the book where Luke and Bob are in class on the day JFK is assassinated, and it's important to their backstory of what there's something that happens in their childhood involving them and two other key characters in the book that is really critical to the story. And so I kind of recounted it the way I remembered it. And then, we went off to college in the early 70s, and, this motley looking crew actually all turned out okay. This is the staff of the Western Courier circa 1973 or so. I'm the then skinny guy in the flannel shirt there in the front. And surprisingly, looking at this group, most of us turned out all right. There's journalists, lawyers, consultants, political people, apartment managers, and on and on. So for parents that are worried about their kids, they'll probably be okay. But the Vietnam era on college campuses is also an important part of the story, particularly of Killing the Curse, and then it later comes on in Season of Lies. Particularly the environmental movement and the more extreme versions of the environmental movement. And you might be surprised to learn that the campus of Western Illinois University, which is sort of in the middle of nowhere near the Mississippi River in Keokuk, Iowa, really was a hotbed of student radicalism. I wasn't deeply involved in that hardcore radical left, although involved enough from people I knew that the FBI, I actually do have an FBI file, which is kind of funny because they concluded I was relatively harmless. I don't know whether that's a compliment or not. But a lot of the people I knew were part of what was called the White Panther Party, and no, that was not a white supremacist group. The White Panthers were supporters of the Black Panther Party, a black radical group. Their leader was a guy from Michigan named John Sinclair, who also was the manager of the legendary rock band MC5, which probably invented heavy metal before the term heavy metal was invented. And Sinclair and some of his radical politics also was part of the story. All right, well, let's get to some baseball stuff. Anybody from Chicago or anybody who ever watched Will Ferrell impersonate him on Saturday Night Live knows that this is Harry Carey. Harry is in the book a little bit as a kind of a minor character in a couple spots. And the guy on the left, the short guy on the left, the bald guy on the left is my good friend Brian Davis. Brian and I kind of came up together as journalists. We actually met covering a murder trial in Kenosha, Wisconsin in the late 70s. And Brian went on to a career in sports talk and then eventually became the television play-by-play guy for the Oklahoma City Thunder in the NBA. Brian was in a world that I didn't inhabit, which, I was part of the media, but not in radio. And Brian was a great copy editor for me for Killing the Curse because he would be able to help me bring the dialogue to life. Like for a simple example is someone who calls frequently into a radio talk show is called a repeater. So that's a word I didn't know. And Tommy is a repeater. My bad guy, Tommy, is a repeater. Brian also gave me some Harry Carey nuggets that I think really helped the story. So thank you, Brian. And again, it's part of the effort to bring authenticity and credibility to the writing. This, of course, is the most famous Cubs curse, the Billy Goat curse, and this is William Cianis, who owned the Billy Goat Tavern, the famous cheeseburger tavern, or Saturday Night Live fame in Chicago under the L tracks. As the story goes, because of the odor of his pet goat, he was not allowed into the 1945 World Series, which was the first time the Cubs have been back to the World Series in years. And again, they were trying to win for the first time since 1908, something they didn't accomplish until 2016. And when Cianis and the goat couldn't get into Wrigley Field, they put a curse on the Cubs. So that's the most famous curse. And it kind of gets the story rolling in the prologue of Killing the Curse, because this is what prompts a radio station owner who gets totally disgusted with the Cubs because of this and all the other crazy things that have happened over the years. And then this is the famous Steve Bartman incident in 2003, as I recall, which the fly ball drops. Bartman leans out, blocks a fly ball that Moises Alou in the left fielder for the Cubs thinks he can catch. He can't catch it. The Florida Marlins end up with this huge rally and go on to the World Series with a team that is really a good a team as the Cubs have ever had. And of course, it wasn't really Bartman's fault. The real fault was the collapse of the Cubs' offense and defense in the moments after the fly ball drops. And then in the start of Killing the Curse, the Cubs lose my fictional game 6 in a very Cub-like way, and it's just the last straw. So the funny thing was, and I mentioned earlier how, I thought I knew a lot more than I did, and as I did research on the Cubs, read several books about baseball, about the Cubs, and so on and so forth, I realized there were a lot of curses I didn't even know about, and I could talk about several of them here, like the black cat that ran in front of Ron Santo in 1969, when everybody thought they were going to go to the World Series that year, and they didn't make it. But my favorite one involves Bill Buckner. Everybody who's not from Chicago mainly knows Bill Buckner as the guy who let a ball go through his legs, costing the Red Sox their trip to the World Series, their chance, to break their curse. But the fact is, if you're from Chicago, you think of Buckner as one of the most, unfairly maligned ball players in history, because he was a great ball player for the Cubs and before that the Dodgers, before the Cubs traded him to the Red Sox. But this is supposedly true when he committed the famous error that put all of Red Sox Nation in mourning for years. He was wearing his Cubs batting glove under his first baseman's mitt. So if that's not a great Cubs curse story, I don't know what is. There's a lot of Cincinnati stuff in both my books, because I worked in Cincinnati for over 8 years, and my daughter still lives there, and I just know a little bit about Cincinnati, and I needed to set up some things plot-wise that put both the Cubs and the president in Cincinnati. In Killing the Curse, I have President Murphy in Cincinnati at the same time as Oktoberfest in Cincinnati. And I did take some poetic license with that. It's a huge celebration that oddly is in September, even though it's called Oktoberfest. I needed it to be in October for reasons of my plot. So there you go. I did take some license there, but it's a huge event, lots of people around, and I needed that setting for some of the mayhem that was going to ensue. Murphy gives a speech. I have him walking through the Hilton Netherland Plaza Hotel in downtown Cincinnati, which is this beautiful Art Deco era hotel, as gorgeous as any hotel you'll ever see. The hotel purportedly is haunted, or may be haunted, and we talk about that a little bit. Then he gets on a plane. He's flying over Cincinnati. You see the Bengals Stadium to the left, Great American Ballpark where the Reds play to the right. He's looking out the window, as I certainly looked out many times flying from Cincinnati. And what does he see but the outfield wall falling down because of an explosion? And this is a key event in the story that, really tells people there may be a lot more at stake here than just than just a ball game, Some other things that authors do, particularly in thrillers, is they blow things up and have crazy things happen. And again, I think it's just important to, to do the homework that's required. This is the Ferris wheel in Navy Pier in Chicago. It's huge. It's a huge Ferris wheel, and I needed to know for story purposes how fast it moves, how big it is, how long it would take theoretically to evacuate it in an emergency. If you had to bring each gondola, which holds about 12 people down one at a time, get people off, bring it down, empty it, and so on and so forth before something really bad and ugly happens. And this is going on actually during Game 7 of the World Series. Killing the Curse is basically a 3-day story with backstories, but everything unfolds in this very compressed 3-day window, which is one reason I think it's probably a pretty good read. The other things authors do are things like this. I needed to know if there's any documented incidents of cell phones exploding and injuring and killing people, and the answer to that is yes. In fact, the most vulnerable people to cell phone injuries, it turns out, actually are people that work in factories, particularly those making aftermarket batteries and parts like that. But there are documented incidents of injuries. Again, really important in Killing the Curse in terms of a setup scene. In Season of Lies, in order to get a guy into a very secure situation involving President Murphy, I have him using a 3D printer to print a plastic gun, which we know is certainly possible in order to get past a metal detector. And we talked about the hijacked OnStars system in Chapter 1 of Killing the Curse. I also liked having my characters mingle with real people, and you're not just doing this to sometimes just set tone and scene. It's really part of character development. And one of the things I'm in all modesty proudest about with the 2 books is the compliments I get about character development and dialogue. I'd like these people to see these as more than thrillers. I don't overdo the baseball stuff. It's not an inside baseball kind of a novel. It's what happens to these characters. They're hopefully characters you care about. You want to know what's going to happen to them. And part of Bob Walter's story, he's a newspaper reporter, a newspaper columnist before he becomes the Rush Limbaugh of sports radio. And how did he become that way? And early in all of our careers, whatever we do, we need mentors, we need heroes. And one of the heroes that Bob looks up to is the legendary Chicago then Daily News columnist Mike Royko, who went on to the Trib. And if you were from Chicago in that era and you didn't read Mike Royko, you were probably in the minority. And in the book, Bob gets a chance to sort of meet his hero at the Billy Goat Tavern. And in very Mike Royko style, of course, he treats Bob kind of like a minion, sort of like a little bit like Dirt, but that's part of the fun. But putting him in there is also part of Bob's character development, and won't bother people who aren't from Chicago. But for people who are from Chicago, it's something that can really kind of resonate. I put quotes around the word real here. The real McCoys, of course, aren't real people, but they were a real television show in the 60s. And Luke, one of the cheesiest television series of all time. And part of the backstory involves a lot of bullying, junior high age, middle school age bullying that goes on with Bob and Luke and 2 other important characters. And part of it is dubbing them with nicknames from the real McCoys, including Pepino, who is the Hispanic worker in the real McCoys. Talk about politically incorrect. And then the guy on the right is named Moose Skowron, and he was a great slugger first baseman for the Yankees, the Dodgers, and the Chicago White Sox. One of my main characters in the book is named Scott Skowron, who ends up getting severely injured, in fact, disabled for life as a result of this childhood incident that's in Killing the Curse. And because Scott was a great athlete, and because he's sort of from that era, his nickname was Moose. So that's where I got Moose Skowron from the real life Moose Skowron. This is one of my favorite things to talk about when I do this little program. This is Eddie Sykott. He was a pitcher for the 1919 Chicago Black Sox. And the Black Sox, if you've ever seen the movie 8 Men Out or know anything at all about American sports, you know that the Black Sox scandal is one of the biggest scandals in American sports history, in which a bunch of severely underpaid players for the Chicago White Sox basically laid down and lost the World Series to the Cincinnati Reds after a bunch of gamblers approached them and offered them a lot of money, certainly by the standards of the time, to not play to win. Sykot is not as well known as Shoeless Joe Jackson and some of the other players on this great Chicago ball club, which probably should have beaten the Reds in a normal situation. Sorry, Rick. But Sykot, the owner of the White Sox, Charles Comiskey, was so cheap that he ordered the manager not to let Sykot pitch in the last game of the season, because Sykot had won 29 games. And if he won 30 games, which was not an unheard of number back in that era, he was going to get a $10,000 bonus. So by not letting him pitch in that last game of the season, the regular season, he basically screwed Sykot out of $10,000. So probably the best twist in Killing the Curse, and I think it's a pretty good one. Later in the story, because so much is at stake for the Cubs having to win the 7th game, they have to do a complete 180 on the 1919 World Series. In the 1919 World Series, the bad guys paid the White Sox to lose. In my fictional World Series, the good guys are telling the Cubs and the Red Sox they have to do whatever it takes to make sure the Cubs win. So that even if the Cubs can't win on the up and up, then the key players on both sides know that things will happen so that the Cubs win, because lives are literally at stake. So it's like this twisty 180 on the 1919 World Series. So I kind of liked that. We're going to get into some stuff in Season of Lies now, and this actually should be showing a lunar eclipse and not a solar eclipse. There's a crazy astronomical event that opens the story. And again, imagine the Cubs are actually playing in the World Series in this opening scene. And meanwhile, everyone's kind of wondering what's going to happen. They know this comet is coming at the Earth, but it's probably going to miss the Earth. There's going to be a lunar eclipse at the same time. And what happens is crazy, because the comet, you can see the comet's tail, in part because of the eclipse. And the visible tail crosses the sky in the shape of a biblical cross. The tail actually looks like a biblical cross, which is kind of interesting as we're looking at Easter in a couple of days too. I just happened to think. So imagine the fervor that this would set off around the world. And there's going to be even more fervor, as you'll see on the next slide, that unleashes a 3-way presidential race. It also nearly cost the Cubs the World Series, because an outfielder who's quite religious gets distracted by this visual and drops a ball that could cause the Cubs to lose the game. So the backstory on this is, one of my draft readers was an astronomy buff, and he goes, I think the way you're describing this, Dennis, it couldn't happen. I actually had the comet then landing in Indonesia near the island of Bali, which again, I'll talk more about in the next slide, what I did instead. So it does crash. And a comet, by the way, if a comet were to hit Earth, these are like big, huge frozen rocks, it would be the equivalent of the gigantic asteroid that hit the Yucatan Peninsula eons ago. It would be awful. We can't even imagine what this would unleash in terms of tragic events for humanity. So I had a real astronomer that he helped me find read that chapter, and he said, no, that's impossible. That's astronomically impossible. And I knew most readers would never figure that out or even probably care. But I said, okay, what if we da-da-da-da-da? And the way I describe it in the book, he finally conceded the point that, okay, that's really unlikely, but it's not impossible. And I said, that's good enough, because it's fiction. So supposedly this has the seal of approval by an astronomer, or something could happen. So the way I react to this actually made the story better. Right after the comet incident, an uncharted meteor strikes into Bali, which has been the scene of a considerable amount of Islamic terrorism. Muslims are killed in it. This is right on the heels of this cross-shaped comet going through a lunar eclipse. And again, this really happened. It happened in 2013 in Russia. You say, don't they know all meteors are coming? No, they don't. In 2013, there were about 1,000 people injured when a meteor hit in a remote part of Russia, breaking glass. That was what caused most of the injuries. So it in fact really does happen. We got into a lot of political stuff in these books because they're about sports and politics. And one of the backstories involving Luke Murphy that comes to light in the second book, in Season of Lies, is a alleged homosexual incident in his college days. And we make some reference to the fact that if we were to have a gay president, whether it was Pete Buttigieg in real life or Luke Murphy in my book, he probably is not our first gay president. That honor would probably belong to James Buchanan, although we don't know that for sure. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence that Buchanan and his longtime friend Rufus King might have had something going on. Not that there's anything wrong with that. They lived together for 13 years. And in fact, Rufus King actually was vice president of the United States for a few years. They both were lifelong bachelors. And as you might imagine, back in that day, just as in today, people, tongues kind of wagged about, what that was all about. I also had to do a lot of research. And again, this goes back to my point about, we think, when we write about things that we think we know a lot about, we are often surprised that we don't know as much as we think we do. And I had to do quite a bit of research on third-party candidates to have a plausible path for Lydia Nix, my third-party candidate, who's inspired by all this religious fervor to take on Luke Murphy in the election and do whatever it takes to try to win, whether how plausible it would be for her to get on the ballot in 50 states and even have a chance to win. And some of you will recognize some of the people in these pictures. Teddy Roosevelt ran for the Bull after he had been president 2 terms as a Bull Moose Party. George Wallace, the racist governor of Alabama, who had a late life epiphany after that, who ran against Nixon, and Ralph Nader, Ross Perot, and I think that's Strom Thurmond in the lower right. Third-party candidates are huge disruptive forces if they can, gain enough traction to actually win, and or to actually get a significant number of votes, I should say. We don't have any recent history of one winning, but it's not unreasonable to say certainly that Ralph Nader probably made George W. Bush president, because Florida was so close in that election that those thousands of votes that Nader got as a third-party candidate, it's plausible that most of those are votes that would have gone to Al Gore. Third-party candidates tend to be most dangerous to those candidates who they're most closely aligned with politically. So ironically, they help the candidate that they're furthest apart from. And of course, same goes for Ross Perot with George Bush the first making Bill Clinton president, and so on and so forth. I probably underplayed how difficult it really is for a third-party candidate to get on the ballot in all 50 states. The two things that the two major political parties do seem to agree on is that they have bipartisan agreement. They want to make it really hard for third-party candidates to get any foothold on the ballot, which is kind of sad and depressing if you think about it. I would also, Luke Murphy, in my mind, is sort of the moderate Republican. He could have easily been a moderate Democrat that a lot of us wish we could vote for, unlike what we're seeing in politics today. I talk in the book about what some of the machinations they have to go through without getting way into the weeds to make her candidacy viable. But if anything, it's even harder than the way I describe it in Season of Lies. There's also a steroid scandal involving Trey Van Omen in the second book, as these forces of evil try to do politics of destruction to try to destroy his career. We're getting a little tight on time, so I'm going to try to hustle it up here so there's time for some questions if anybody has any. I had to do some research on the chemistry of steroids. I needed to know how much you would have to dilute steroids, in this case in something like Gatorade, so that it would be measurable in someone's blood, but not obvious. And of course, as the slide on the left demonstrates, there's certainly been, rampant abuse of steroids in recent past in professional sports. And some people have even died, like Ken Caminiti, a great ball player. And, I had to do some of the research to learn a little bit more about how they worked. So now I want to just go into a sneak preview of some stuff we're going to be getting in the new book, The Vanished, which should be out later this year with any luck, or early next. And The Vanished is very different than these two books. The basic premise of The Vanished is there's a young reporter who, sadly, not unlike many real-life reporters, has been laid off from multiple newspaper jobs. She's come back to her town in Brunswick County, North Carolina, where I live now, with her hat in her hand. Her fiance is dead in a car accident. She's living in the bedroom in her parents' house, trying to get her life back together. She and a buddy are running a local news website in Brunswick County, North Carolina, beach town. And one day, this strange object crashes onto the football field of their local high school. And the authorities seal off the area. She gets a tip. She sneaks through the woods and the swamp to try to get to the edge of the football field. She sees something, and then she disappears, and no one knows why. And the story really is about what happens to Olivia. That's her name, Olivia Clavin, kind of a millennial-aged young journalist, and the efforts of her father, Jim, to who won't give up, trying to find her. The backstories of The Vanished, and this is what I'm going to talk about for the purposes of this little session, involve a lot of research I had to do into some stuff that had always fascinated me, but I never delved into, about the UFOs in the 40s, 50s, into the 60s, and a lot of the secret research the Nazis did during World War II. So you can kind of think of this book as sort of a genre bender. It's not a crazy out there sci-fi thing, but it's got a crazy backstory involving things that I honestly learned in my research are not that crazy. There's an amazing amount of stuff that's happened that we really should know more about, that like really happened. One of those are called the Foo Fighters, and I didn't know where the rock band Foo Fighters got their name. It turns out they got their name from all these crazy things that happened at the end of World War II, completely documented. Allied fighters, Japanese, German fighters would see these lights, these aerial things going on that had aeronautic qualities that no existing airplane or helicopter or anything that humans had, could do as far as anybody knew. They could stop and start, move up and down, twist and move all around. And they were called Foo Fighters, named after a comic strip of the day called Smokey Stover. And Smokey would use the term foo, and they were called Foo Fighters. And I thought that, and so that was one thing I learned. I think the most interesting things I learned were digging into a lot of the research the Nazis did during World War II. They were really way ahead of us in a lot of ways. Most people have heard of Werner von Braun, the famous rocket scientist who the Allies captured at the end of World War II, and then he became one of the fathers of the Apollo space program. Someone who very few people have heard about, which kind of fascinated me the more I learned about him, other than people that are really buffs and into this stuff, is a guy named Hans Kammler. And it's amazing we don't know, or more people don't know more about him, because he was at Hitler's right hand in many ways. He was an engineer. He was ruthless. He designed concentration camps. He got slave labor into a lot of the Nazi secret research. He knew a lot of the, most of the Nazi secrets Hans Kammler knew. At the end of World War II, and again, this is well documented, there was something called Operation Paperclip, which was this race by the Allies, particularly the U.S., to get as many of these captured Nazi scientists into their into our orbit versus the Soviets, because we all wanted, both sides wanted them. They wanted the knowledge that these guys had. The search for Kamler is fascinating because there's so much we don't know. Somebody may know, but we don't know what really happened to Hans Kamler, and that's in spite of everything. The photo on the right, I should add, is taken at the Ebensee, Austria concentration camp, which is one of the scenes in The Vanished, where we do know, again, it's documented, much secret research was conducted there. There were underground tunnels. Kamler probably was there at some point. The Nazis even had bases in Antarctica. There's a lot of speculation about what they were really up to. The one thing I would say to reinforce my point, if you get a minute and you're interested in this subject, type the words Kecksburg, Pennsylvania into Google and read about a 60s UFO incident in Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, Kecksburg, which also is part of The Vanished, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So that's kind of it, other than the shameless self-promotion part. And I want to talk about how to get books. The first and probably best way right now is to go to headlinebooks.com, search on my name, order the book, and we will arrange to send you a personalized copy. I'll glad to sign it with free shipping. No shipping charge, and we'll try to get the books to you promptly. You also can go to Amazon, of course, where they're both physical and Kindle books, and we're now part of the Kindle program, where if you're in that program, you can read it for part of your monthly or regular fee. You can go to my website, DennisHetzel.com, check me out, or just send an email to drhetzel@gmail.com, and I'll work with you on whatever your specific need is, not only for books, for speaking, for doing something like this for your book club. Book clubs are a blast. I love doing those. And you go to your local bookstore. If they don't have it in stock, which they may or may not, most of them can order it. If for some reason they can't or they won't, who knows? You hear all kinds of stories. Just email me, and I'll work with our publisher, Kathy Tietz, and we'll figure out how to get books to you. So that's my slide deck. I think we got through this in a pretty good amount of time. I really enjoyed it, and I'm gonna take a look and see if we have any questions here.
We do have a question. We have a question from Rick Robinson. He says, Dennis, how hard was it as a writer to go from newspaper reporter / editor to novelist?
It was easy in some ways and an adjustment in others. I don't think it was a huge difficult adjustment for me, just because I like to write and edit. The rewriting and editing parts were pretty natural, not that tough. Obviously writing a 100,000 word book is a lot different than writing a 500 or 600 word newspaper story or editorial in terms of structure and plot, all that stuff. But the biggest difference probably is just stylistically. In newspaper writing, quotes are like spice. You might interview someone for 2 or 3 hours or even more and just use one direct quote, and you paraphrase everything else. Whereas in fiction writing, good fiction, dialogue, I wouldn't say it drives everything, but it drives almost everything. You need great dialogues, and if you don't have really well-written, believable dialogue with the characters talking, and I'm thinking right now, because of having just done the session about Eddie Sykott in the section in Killing the Curse, where they're talking about how they're going to fix the World Series so the Cubs can win. I mean, I think there's some good dialogue there. There's one of my favorite scenes in the second book are the quieter scenes where Murphy and his wife are fighting. Luke Murphy and his wife are fighting, and they're in a very passive aggressive way, as so many couples will do. And they're in the White House kitchen, the little kitchen area, just quietly talking to each other, and you can just feel, how bitter they are to each other. And, that's just something you wouldn't do in all but the most featureized kind of newspaper writing. So, that part is different, but it's also about pace. So, you learn that, if you just need to get a character from point A to point B, but other than that, it's not that significant to the story. You don't put a lot of dialogue in there. You just take them from point A to point B. So, you pick your spots. So that's one of the big differences.
Great. Well, I believe that answers all of the questions that we have. So if someone does think of a question that they would like to ask you later, how would they contact you?
The easiest way is drhetzel@gmail.com, but I'm also on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. I can take messages at my Dennis Hetzel website. And, I'm always glad to answer questions and help people out. I enjoy working with writers. I've coached a few, and it's a lot of fun.